Perhaps it's always been this way, but the UK is experiencing a heightened sense of political polarisation at this time. And in these circumstances, most of us lose our objectivity to some degree or another. If we're against something, particularly a political party or a movement, we'll find fault with it no matter what. We reach a point where we can only see the negatives and almost gleefully wait for a mistake to be made. We get that sense here in Gennesaret, where some teachers of the law had made a 100-mile journey up to the region from Jerusalem. And once again, they're concerned with what Jesus is saying and doing, always with a critical eye. They don't like him for a whole host of reasons. And if they can trip him up on something, particularly a point of law, they're onto a winner. They can put him in his place and at the same time re-establish their own position as spiritual and moral guardians. Now, there are two issues here, both of which Jesus addresses. The first is to do with tradition and authority. The second is to do with ceremonial purity. Notice the first words that Mark records. The Pharisees and teachers of the law asked Jesus, "Why don't your disciples live according to the tradition of the elders?" Now, this in itself is interesting because the Pharisees are attacking Jesus through his disciples. Indirectly, they're accusing the great rabbi of leading his disciples astray. And critically, they attack him on a point of ritual, not of faith. And moreover, this is a point of ritual drawn not directly from the law, but from a tradition that was growing up around the law. Later, it would be enshrined to form the modern Jewish Talmud. So the concern here is a mingling of tradition and authority. Essentially, they're asking, why don't you live according to our rules? Now, Jesus, as always, is an absolute master of the rebuttal. Notice how he launches straight into a damning diagnosis. Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you hypocrites. Now, perhaps you've come across this meme which features a picture of Jesus driving out money changers from the temple. You remember he made a whip and drove them out. And this meme highlights this rather sanitized and civilized picture we tend to have of Jesus, someone who's very kind, accepting, and non-judgmental. Well, Jesus certainly could be, but he could also be unsparing in his denunciation, most notably when his audience A, should have known better, and B, held a position of influence over others. Look at James chapter 3 verse 1, where James says, "Not many of you should become teachers, my fellow believers, because you know that we who teach will be judged more strictly." Writing on this verse, John Piper says, "The principle behind the judgment is that you will be judged because you knew what you should do, and the assumption is teachers, by teaching, are claiming to know what they ought to do, and therefore they have greater judgment if they fall short." Now, James, of course, is talking about Christian believers who teach, but the principle remains the same, because those who teach have at least some influence on some people. So when Jesus turns to address the crowds in Mark chapter 7, verse 14, it's as if he's looking to correct the people from the false teaching of the Pharisees. And this is Jesus' verdict on the Pharisees. They don't care about people. In fact, they don't really care about God. And on these 2 points, they've grossly neglected the 2 greatest commandments. Firstly, to love the Lord with all their heart, soul, and strength. And secondly, to love their neighbour as themselves. But there was something far worse at play, because these new rules they'd concocted actively led to disobedience, to which Jesus gives an example. By claiming that certain gifts were consecrated to God, the Pharisees were able to justify abandoning their responsibility to their mother and father. And notice how Jesus mentions the law of Moses in comparison to the traditions of men that the Pharisees held to. As one commentary notes, God's voice was muted by the Pharisees' earthly traditions. Now here's why Jesus declared their worship to be in vain. Because you cannot truly worship God if your heart is far from Him, and your heart cannot be close to Him if you're habitually living with sin and disobedience. And that takes us on to our second point of contention. So Jesus has dealt with the Pharisees. Their hypocrisy and self-serving rules have disqualified them from making any judgments about Jesus or his disciples. But Jesus doesn't simply ignore the criticism that they bring about ritual uncleanness. Instead, he addresses the wider crowd here to instruct them on the real truth about defilement and sin. You see, the Pharisees suggested that what goes into our bodies, i.e. certain foods, would make us unclean. And Jesus called that nonsense. He wanted his audience to understand the true nature of sin, that it's not something external to us like food, but something wholly internal. Now, this is not a popular idea today at all, because we live in a culture of blame, a culture in which people are fiercely self-righteous and seek to find the sin in other people. A friend of mine recently made this comment, which I think sums up very well the attitude of the Pharisees, and yet it's also troublingly true of us today. He said, the worry is that by obsessing about other people's perceived bad behaviour and bad values, a person starts to feel superior and also overlooks their own bad behaviour. It's a worrying form of self-righteousness for some. Self-righteousness was the blight of the Pharisees, and we must be very careful ourselves. In our anger at unrighteousness, are we missing the plank in our own eyes? Jesus said that the problem of defilement and corruption does not come from the outside. In particular, it doesn't come from food, which has no inherent value. Food is consumed, digested, assimilated and excreted. It has no influence on the heart or the mind. When Jesus says nothing that enters a person from the outside can defile them, he qualifies that statement by saying it enters the stomach as opposed to the heart. He's therefore referring specifically to food. We shouldn't expand Jesus' words to things like films, TV shows, music, magazines, books, and websites. These do have inherent values, and they absolutely can influence our hearts and our minds. Food is essentially neutral. Media is not. So Jesus says in regard to food, corruption does not come from what is outside us, it comes from what is within us. Jesus said, "For it is from within, out of a person's heart, that evil thoughts come, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, lewdness, envy, slander, arrogance, and folly. All these evils come from inside and defile a person." Jesus wasn't interested in the stomach. He was interested in the heart, for the heart is where the battle rages. Remember his words in Matthew 6:21, "For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." Conflict between our natures, sinful and spiritual, are waged and fought in the heart. Worship is characterized by serving one another. Have you ever wondered why Jesus focused on loving God and loving one another, the two greatest commandments? Well, it's because they're two sides of the same coin. We demonstrate our love for God, our worship, by serving one another. The Pharisees, on the other hand, well, they served themselves. They had no regard for others and, said Jesus, they ultimately had no regard for God. Worship is inherently communal. It's one of the main reasons why we opted for Zoom as our online service platform. Worship is not simply about coming together, it's about serving and ministering to one another. Ask yourself, what do you contribute in the way of serving and ministering to one another? Can you name at least one act of service that specifically addresses the spiritual welfare of others? Jesus answers the issue of what it means to worship God, but he also teaches an important lesson on the nature of sin and righteousness. The heart is the dwelling place of sin, and it is the heart that we must guard. We should not become so focused on external factors that we forget to examine our own attitudes and inclinations. What is the nature of our own worship? Is it attending a morning service once a week? Or is it a life consecrated to God and to others? When we honour God with our lips, may our words be a true reflection of our hearts.